It's February 2025. It's so cold and we have a nice blanket of snow covering the ground. Last summer, we were fortunate to have harvested tons of tomatoes, many of which I was able to can fresh right out of the garden. I made several jars of pizza sauce, whole tomatoes, diced tomatoes, salsa. I used up a lot of tomatoes from the garden, canning up recipes that we like to eat throughout the year. But then there was a whole bunch of other tomatoes that I was able to freeze very simply by washing the tomatoes, coring them, removing any yucky spots, and sticking them in a freezer bag and putting them right into the freezer. Last summer, we were fortunate to have harvested tons of tomatoes, and I'm going to be turning all of the ones that I froze into marinara sauce. It's a super easy recipe, and the method is easy, and it's going to free up a ton of much needed space in my freezer. This is what the consistency will look like, and I'm using all of dry herbs that we usually have in our pantry. The first thing I do is get all of the bags of tomatoes out of our big freezer downstairs, and I allow them to defrost. I have so many bags, though, that there isn't enough room to put them all in my sink. So I'm going to use a large stock pot and the insert for my large roaster. Place them on a large bath towel to absorb any condensation and put the remaining bags in the sink. The next day, most of the tomatoes have defrosted well enough. Some of them were still pretty frozen though. Throughout the morning, I drain the excess water from the bags, pull the skins off of the tomatoes, and add them to the large stock pot. I'm pretty sure all of the tomatoes, as they defrost and shrink down, will fit into the stock pot at this point. So I'm just going to, throughout the day, peel the skins and get them over to it. Some of the tomatoes are still pretty frozen, so I wait for them to defrost a bit more before removing the skins and adding them to the stock pot as well. After I get everything into the pot, I'm just going to let it sit in on the towel because of all the condensation. The towel will absorb it and it won't create any puddling on my stove. Periodically, I dump out the water that's pooling up inside the pot. This will help to limit the cooking time later and just get rid of any excess water, whether it be from frost when I washed them before I froze them. It's just water. It's not anything to save or repurpose. So I drain the water a few times before bringing them over to the stove to start cooking them down on a very low heat. In order to prevent any burning on the bottom, I keep the burner on a very low setting. Once everything is heated through, I start to run all of the tomatoes through a food mill. I use the finest attachment that I have so that most of the seeds and any skin remnants are removed from the sauce, leaving me with a really fine tomato puree. Steve helped me with this process though, because it was a lot, and I really appreciate his help. At this point, it is getting late in the day, and I opt to move the mixture to the refrigerator until tomorrow to make the marinara and then can it. The next morning, I dump all of the tomato puree back into the stock pot to heat it through. The color is a nice bright red, and there isn't much water content to it because I had previously drained off so much of it the day prior. I add 3 cans of tomato paste just to thicken it up a little bit, and this will also help to get the most out of the puree. It speeds up the process, and I won't have to worry about cooking out any of the excess water. I turn the heat to low and slowly let it heat up, making sure that I stir it up occasionally to prevent any burning on the bottom. I am using the electric water bath canner, but it is the same process as a traditional stovetop canner, or if you're just using a regular stock pot with a lid. Just make sure there is some sort of rack at the bottom of the pot to prevent the jars from sitting directly on the bottom. It can cause them to crack. To the water bath canner, I add water fairly high up because we're going to be canning with quart-size jars, and there needs to be enough water to cover about an inch over the lids. Now that the sauce is heated through, I'm going to add some spices that I like to add. These are all optional things. You can flavor it however you like. I don't have exact measurements because I'm unsure how much tomato puree I have in the pot. So I add as much as I think, taste it, and then add more if needed. First, I'm adding a generous palmful of garlic powder. A handful of dried oregano. A coating of black pepper, a sprinkle of onion powder, and several pinches of salt. I tasted some of it and it needed more garlic powder, oregano, and salt. I tasted again and it was perfect. So I let that sit on a low heat to simmer together for a bit while I got the jars and lids ready for canning. I'm using both wide mouth and regular mouth quart-sized jars. I wash the canning lids in warm soapy water. each quart-size jar, I'm adding 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. If you want to use citric acid, I believe it's 1/2 teaspoon for a quart-size jar. It's just to keep the acidity to a good, safe level for water bath canning. I then add the marinara to each jar, leaving 1/2 inch of headspace. Headspace is the distance between the contents of the jar and the lid. Overfilling a jar can prevent the lids from sealing, and with liquid items can cause siphoning, which is when the contents of the jar escapes during the canning process via the lid. Headspace varies depending on what you're canning. For example, it's only 1/4 inch when canning jam. So it's important to read the recipe that you are following and make sure you leave the appropriate headspace for whatever you are canning. Before placing the lids on the jars, I wipe off the rims using distilled white vinegar and a lint-free cloth. Making sure that the rims are clean will help to ensure that the lids seal properly to the tops of the jars. Then I center the lid onto the jar and tighten the jar with just the tips of my fingers until resistance is met. Over tightening a jar lid can cause lids not to seal properly, so just using the tips of the fingers and tightening them until the resistance is met in the band. I then add 6 quarts to the canner, adding enough water to have about 1 inch over the top of the lids, which also is the max fill line for the electric canner. While I wait for the canner to get up to a steady boil, I get the rest of the jars filled. The canner needs to be at a steady rolling boil before we start the timer for 40 minutes. After the time is up, I turn the heat off, remove the lid so that it's pointed away from the face, and let the jar sit there for another 5 minutes. This allows the jars to cool slightly before removing them from the canner and placing them on a folded towel on the counter. You don't want to remove the hot jars from the canner and immediately place them onto a cool countertop because the temperature change can cause the jars to crack. I repeat the same process with the other 5 jars. jars will sit on the counter for about a day before I test the seals, remove the bands, label, and write the date that it was canned on top. Typically, it's recommended that these home canned foods are eaten within a year of canning. However, it's always important to check seals, make sure that the jars are being stored in a cool, dark location, and practice all food safety. That's going to be it for this video, though. Thanks so much for watching. We will see you next time. Bye!